6 feet. That's how thick the logs were. Douglas fir trunks, so massive that the tallest man couldn't wrap his arms around them. 54 of them stood in 2 rows down the center of a cathedral made entirely of wood, their bark still intact, hand-selected from old-growth forests where some had been saplings before Columbus sailed. The ceiling soared 48 feet above the floor. Skylights ran the length of the nave. When you stood beneath those columns and looked up, you weren't looking at a building. You were standing inside what the Pacific Northwest used to be. It burned in 2 hours. 45 minutes after the caretaker locked up for the night on August 17, 1964, the entire structure was gone. The fire that night was so massive that flames shot 10 stories into the Portland sky. The heat shattered windows a full block away. Ash fell like snow across the neighborhood. And when the sun came up the next morning, all that remained of the Forestry Building, the structure that had been called the Parthenon of Oregon, the log cathedral, one of the largest log structures ever built in America, was a smoking foundation and a city that couldn't quite believe what it had just lost. The building was made of wood that had survived nearly 60 years. What finally killed it was the original 1905 electrical wiring. Portland in 1905 was a city trying to prove something. For decades it had been overshadowed by San Francisco and Seattle. The Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition opened that June on 400 acres of transformed marshland along Gilds Lake, designed to announce that the Pacific Northwest had arrived, that this was a place of timber and wheat and shipping, a place where empires came to grow. The fair was conceived in 1900 by Portland businessmen led by banker Henry W. Corbett and Oregonian editor Harvey Scott. They spent 2 years transforming a marshy slough into an elaborate fairground. Landscape architect John Olmsted designed the grounds. Engineer William Maxwell leveled the site, installed plumbing, and set up a system to pump 20 million gallons of Willamette River water into Gilds Lake every day. Over the entrance gate they hung the motto, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way." Most of the exposition buildings went up in months, temporary structures of plaster over wooden frames. The Agricultural Palace, the Foreign Exhibits Building, the Oriental Palace, all painted white and decorated in Spanish Renaissance style. Mayor George H. Williams described the view as a diamond set in a coronet of emeralds. The temporary buildings cost 79 cents per square foot. The Forestry Building cost $30,000. It was never meant to be temporary. Architect Ion Lewis of the Portland firm Whidden and Lewis, working with his assistant Albert E. Doyle, designed it in the shape of a crucifix, 206 feet long, 102 feet wide, 7 stories tall. The structure required 1,000,000 board feet of lumber. Lumber Baron Simon Benson paid for most of the giant logs himself, selecting them from old-growth forests in Columbia County, Oregon. He wanted specific trees, ancient Douglas firs that had grown straight and massive, the kind of timber already becoming harder to find. Some logs were 54 feet long and 5 feet wide. One weighed 32 tons. They had to be handled with extraordinary care during cutting and transport to preserve the bark, which stayed on, unpeeled, untreated, exactly as the trees had grown. Loggers had never been asked to do this. Normally, bark was stripped immediately, considered waste. But for the Forestry Building, the bark was the point. It was proof that these were whole trees, not lumber. A cathedral built from the forest itself. Construction took 2 years. 300 local craftsmen worked on the building. The logs were shipped by train and lifted into place with specialized equipment. The interior colonnade, of 54 massive Douglas fir trunks, had to be hand-matched, each log selected to complement the next, like pearls on a string. The central aisle ran cruciform beneath skylights, flooding the space with natural light so visitors could see the grain of the wood, the texture of the bark, the impossible scale of what they were standing beneath. When the exposition opened on June 1, 1905, over 40,000 visitors attended on the first day. The Forestry Building became what architectural historian Henry Matthews would later call the most popular attraction of the entire fair. Visitors walked through the entrance and stopped. They stood still and looked up. Journalists described it as a veritable cathedral of giant trees. One writer called it the Parthenon of Oregon. Another asked, "Who can comprehend what has transpired in the world's history since the tree from which the 9-foot-wide planks were hewn was a sapling?" The central aisle beneath those skylights was lined by the colonnade of Douglas fir trunks, each one 6 feet across, bark intact, rising 48 feet to support the roof. The logs weren't uniform. Some were thicker at the base, some showed centuries of weather marks, one had a slight curve. But together they created a rhythm, a procession of living wood that pulled the eye upward toward the light. Inside, the building housed exhibits telling the story of the Pacific Northwest timber industry. Taxidermied animals, bears, elk, deer, stood frozen in dioramas of Northwest forests as they'd looked before the axes came. Native American artifacts filled display cases. Miniature sawmills demonstrated how logs were processed. Charts showed growth rates. Displays featured finished lumber products. But everyone who visited remembered the same thing: the logs, the impossible size of them, the fact that you could stand next to one and not be able to wrap your arms even halfway around it. One visitor described the experience as being surrounded by nature on a scale that made you feel tiny. Another said it was like standing in a forest, except the forest had a roof. Children ran between the columns, trying to find one small enough to put their arms around. There wasn't one. The fair ran for 4.5 months. Over that span, 1,588,000 paid admissions were recorded. More than 400,000 visitors came from outside the Pacific Northwest. An extraordinary number for a city of perhaps 120,000. Journalists from the East Coast called the exposition Portland's Pride. The fair turned a profit, $85,000, one of the few expositions in American history to end in the black. Portland's population exploded, from just over 90,000 in 1900 to more than 200,000 by 1910. The city attributed much of that growth to the exposition's success. When the fair ended in October 1905, most buildings came down as planned. The plaster palaces were demolished. The exhibits were packed away. The fairgrounds were cleared. But the Forestry Building stayed. It was reinforced with a concrete foundation and turned over to the state of Oregon as a forestry museum. For nearly 6 decades, it stood at Northwest 28th Avenue and Upshur Street, a monument to what had been cut down to build the city around it. And then the threats began. In 1914, a nearby building caught fire. Flames spread quickly through the wooden neighborhood. The Forestry Building was close enough that embers landed on the roof. Firefighters kept it from catching. The building survived. In the 1920s, talks began about dismantling it entirely. By then, logs the size of the ones in the Forestry Building were nearly impossible to find. The old-growth stands were being cut faster than anyone had anticipated. The logs in the building were worth a fortune if salvaged and sold, but the proposal was rejected. The building had become beloved. It stayed. The state, however, refused to pay for repairs. The building began to deteriorate. Bark beetles moved into the untreated logs. Termites followed. The whole logs used for the balconies began to warp, making them structurally unstable. The roof developed leaks. By the 1940s, the Forestry Building had become a demonstrable safety hazard. The balconies were closed. There was serious official talk of tearing it down before someone got hurt. In the late 1940s, it nearly burned. Sparks from a caretaker's wood-burning stove ignited the roof. Firefighters arrived in time to put it out, but not before the fire had burned a 15-foot hole. The building was closed to the public. For several years it sat empty, decaying, a safety hazard with no budget for repairs. The state wouldn't pay. The city didn't have the funds. It seemed certain the building would either collapse on its own or be demolished as a liability. Then, in the 1950s, the Portland Chamber of Commerce raised money for restoration. It was a private effort, funded by donations. From citizens and businesses who remembered visiting as children, who understood it was irreplaceable. Repairs were made, the roof was patched, exhibits were reinstalled. An old logging locomotive was donated in 1955 and displayed on the grounds. According to the Oregonian, the building was restored to house a priceless collection of logging and lumbering exhibits, both antique and modern. The collection included the first sheet of Douglas fir plywood ever produced, manufactured in 1904 by the Outson family's Portland Manufacturing Company. There were antique logging tools, photographs of early timber operations, dioramas showing how the industry had evolved. By 1959, during Oregon's sesquicentennial celebration, the Forestry Building had become a beloved institution. Every Portland schoolchild took a field trip there. It was a required stop for out-of-town guests. Teachers brought classes to stand beneath those logs and try to comprehend the scale of trees that used to cover the entire region. People who visited as children in the 50s and early 60s would describe the experience in remarkably similar terms. The musty smell of old wood and bark, the way the light came through the skylights and made the grain glow, the feeling of being tiny, insignificant, standing next to trunks so massive they seemed to belong to a different world. One visitor remembered it as standing in a cathedral where the columns were trees. Another said it made you understand in a way no photograph could what the old-growth forests had actually been. It survived another fire scare. It survived decades of deferred maintenance. It survived proposals to tear it down and sell the timber, which by the 1960s would have been worth an extraordinary sum. Old-growth Douglas fir of that size and quality simply didn't exist anymore in accessible forests. The building was, in its own quiet way, a survivor, a fragment of what had been, preserved not in a museum case but as the museum itself. And then came August 17th, 1964. The caretaker locked up around 5:30 that evening. The building was empty. Exhibits were in place. Everything was as it had been for years. 45 minutes later, neighbors noticed something wrong. Flames were visible inside. By the time they called it in and firefighters arrived at 6:15, the entire structure was engulfed. There was nothing they could do. The Oregonian reported the next day. There was never a hope of saving the building. The wood was untreated. The logs were bone dry after nearly 60 years of exposure. The bark, which had been preserved so carefully in 1905, acted as kindling. The entire structure, every column, every beam, every piece of bark-covered timber, went up at once. The building wasn't just burning, it was exploding. Eyewitnesses said the flames reached 10 stories high. The fire lit the evening sky orange for miles. The heat was so intense that windows blew out on the entire south side of the Montgomery Ward building a full block away. Water from the fire hoses carved a trench down the hillside. The neighborhood looked like a war zone. Children who lived nearby watched from their yards, silhouetted against the glow. Families stood on porches blocks away and stared. The fire was visible from downtown. People drove from across the city to watch it burn, unable to look away from something so terrible and so final. Grant Keltner, who lived 4 blocks away, watched from his apartment window. He described it years later as one of the largest fires Portland had ever seen, the granddaddy of all fires in that historic neighborhood, something he knew he would never see again. Other witnesses spoke of the sound, the roar of the flames, the crack and thunder of giant logs splitting in the heat, the shattering of glass, the hiss of water turning instantly to steam. An investigation determined the cause. Faulty vintage electrical wiring from 1905, the original wiring, installed when the building was constructed, had never been fully replaced during the 1950s restoration. Nearly 60 years old, insulated with materials that had degraded over decades, running through walls of dry wood and bark, it had finally failed. A short circuit, a spark, and the building was gone. The timing was cruel. Had the fire broken out an hour earlier, while the caretaker was still inside, He might have seen smoke in time to raise the alarm. Had it started an hour later, the flames might have been spotted sooner from the street. But it started at that threshold moment, just after closing, just before dusk, when the building was empty and locked. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. Nothing was saved from the inside. The priceless logging exhibits, gone. The taxidermied animals that had stood in those dioramas since 1905, gone. The first sheet of Douglas fir plywood ever made, a piece of industrial history documenting the birth of an entire industry, gone. The Native American artifacts, the historical photographs, the antique logging tools, all consumed. The dioramas that had taught generations of Portland children what the old-growth forests looked like, gone. The replica sawmill, the displays, gone. And the building itself, the 54 columns of 6-foot-thick Douglas fir with their bark still intact, the last place in the world where you could stand inside a structure made of trees that size, gone. All of it consumed in a fire fed by the same massive old-growth logs that had made the building worth saving. The bark that had been preserved to prove these were whole trees, not lumber, became the accelerant. The untreated wood selected because it was natural, authentic, real, became the fuel. The building's greatest strength had become its fatal vulnerability. By morning, it was rubble. The day after the fire, Portland's mayor, Terry Shrunk, gathered civic and industry leaders. They conceived the Western Forestry Center, a replacement, a memorial. The city donated land at Washington Park near the Oregon Zoo. Architect John Storrs designed a new building, fire-resistant, modern, safe, concrete and steel, sprinkler systems, updated electrical. Everything the Forestry Building hadn't. It opened on June 5, 1971, 7 years after the fire. In 1986, it was renamed the World Forestry Center to reflect a global focus on forestry. It's still there. You can visit. It has exhibits on sustainable forestry, forest ecosystems, the history of the timber industry. It's educational, well-maintained, purposeful. But it is not the same thing. The old logging locomotive that had been displayed at the Forestry Building, the Shea locomotive nicknamed Peggy, donated in 1955, was damaged but not destroyed in the fire. It was moved to storage, rebuilt by volunteers between 1969 and 1971, and relocated to the World Forestry Center's grounds in 1972. A survivor, one of the only physical remnants of what stood. At Northwest 28th and Upshur. The site itself is condominiums now, old forestry commons, townhouse-style units built in the mid-1980s, tucked against Forest Park. The property listings describe them as well-kept, tree-lined, park-like. They're nice places to live. The people who own them probably have no idea what stood there before. There is a small historical marker on Northwest Upshur Street. If you know where to look, you can find a short retaining wall and set of stairs, remnants visible in old photographs, still there if you know what you're looking for. But the building itself is gone. The logs are gone. The exhibits are gone. The dioramas and the artifacts and the first sheet of plywood and the record of what the Northwest forests looked like when trees grew 6 feet thick are gone. What remains is a question nobody seems to have asked loudly enough while the building still stood. Why wasn't it protected? Why was a structure this significant, this singular, this irreplaceable, allowed to operate for nearly 60 years with the original 1905 wiring still in place? Why did the state refuse to pay for repairs in the 1920s, forcing the building to deteriorate for decades until private donors had to step in? Why did the restoration in the 1950s, funded by donations from citizens who understood the building's value, leave the electrical system untouched? The answers aren't recorded. No documentation survives explaining who made these decisions or why. The decision-making is lost. What we know is this. In the 1940s, when the building had become a demonstrable safety hazard with warped balconies and infestations of bark beetles and termites, there was serious talk of demolishing it. The state wouldn't pay to fix it. The building sat closed and decaying until the Chamber of Commerce raised private funds in the 1950s. But even then, even with restoration money finally available, the electrical system installed in 1905 was left in place. It's possible the building could have been saved that night in 1964 if the wiring had been replaced. It's certain the building could have been saved in the decades before if anyone with the authority and the budget had treated it as what it actually was. Irreplaceable. But that would have required seeing it as irreplaceable, and in a city built by the timber industry, in a region where forests had stretched to the horizon and logs 6 feet thick had once been commonplace, the forestry building was never quite treated as irreplaceable. It was treated as a relic, a curiosity, a leftover from a fair that had ended 60 years earlier. Something remarkable, yes, something beloved by schoolchildren and tourists, but also something made of wood in a wooden city, something that could theoretically be rebuilt if anyone really wanted to. Except you can't rebuild it. The logs don't exist anymore. Old-growth Douglas, fir 6 feet across, 54 feet long, with bark intact. You can't harvest them because the trees are gone, protected now, conserved now, understood now as finite. But in 1905, they were abundant. They were raw material. They were what you cut down to make room for progress. By 1964, they were irreplaceable, but the people tasked with maintaining the building that housed them didn't treat them that way. The forestry building was a record of abundance built at the exact moment that abundance was ending, and the people responsible for preserving it let it decay until 60-year-old wiring killed it in 2 hours. If you're ever in northwest Portland, you can drive down Upshur Street. The condominiums are there, a quiet cluster of townhouses with peaked roofs. The street curves the way it always did. Forest Park rises on one side, green and dense. The neighborhood is quiet, walkable, tree-lined, one of the most desirable parts of the city. If you stand at the corner of Northwest 28th and Upshur, you're standing where the entrance was, where people stood in 1905 and looked up at columns of Douglas fir and understood, maybe for the first time, the scale of what was being cut down around them. Where children stood in the 1950s on field trips and felt small inside a Cathedral of Trees, learning a lesson about loss that wouldn't fully register until they were adults. Where neighbors stood on an August night in 1964 and watched it burn, the flames reaching 10 stories high, the heat shattering windows a block away, the smell of burning wood filling the air for miles. Nothing marks the spot except the condos and the small historical marker and the knowledge, if you carry it, of what used to be there. And that's the absence that defines this story, not just the building, not just the logs, but the fact that something this significant could stand for 60 years, survive multiple threats, become a beloved institution, and still be lost to a wiring system that nobody with the authority to fix it ever bothered to replace. The question isn't what happened to the largest log cabin in America. The question is why nobody made sure it couldn't happen.